Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to our election talk show on the Online Citizen Asia with me, PJ Thum. Now, Singaporeans have overwhelmingly stated they want an internationally respected Indian man who is also well respected by both the PAP and the opposition. But the Prime Minister has said the problem with their Indian man is that he cannot speak Chinese. So the SDP have provided us with an internationally respected Indian man who is respected by both the PAP and the opposition who can speak Chinese. And so I give you the next Prime Minister of Singapore, Paul Tambyah.
Thank you very much. That's way too high a standard to meet. Thank you very, very much. Yes.
Hey, it's what the people want.
So if you say so.
So if you get a chance to be Prime Minister, you will accept it, right?
Of course.
There you have it, everyone.
But frankly, I'm not really that keen on it. But if asked, I will do it.
It is a very difficult job. I mean,
certainly. Well, I've got other interests. My goal is to be Health Minister.
Health Minister. Okay,
and you know, it's kind of tough. I don't think we've ever had a Prime Minister who is also Health Minister. We've had many Prime Ministers who are Finance Ministers,
right?
But never a Prime Minister who is Health Minister.
Okay.
So maybe. Yeah.
Interesting. I think, well, it's the sense of priorities within the cabinet.
Right.
And what I've always found interesting is looking across the border, every Prime Minister of Malaysia has also been, or was first, Education Minister.
That's right.
And it really shows their priorities
Right.
and what they consider important. Right. So, yeah.
Well, our second Prime Minister wasn't he in education for a while?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but not the subsequent ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So let's start with the obvious question. I don't think you need any introduction. Everyone knows who you are. You're chairman of SDP.
Right.
World respected, world famous doctor, and you're also, was it a colonel in the?
No, I'm not. I'm just a major.
Major, sorry,
yeah,
major,
thanks.
sorry,
Yeah.
Major in the SAF, and well respected by the establishment, by the opposition, right? So, can you just tell us a bit about why you joined the SDP and what you're hoping to achieve with the SDP, and and how it jives with your own personal values and vision?
Okay, I think I've told the story before, but I've been in the public sector in healthcare for all my working life, apart from the time I went overseas for my graduate studies. And essentially, I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed working in the public sector. And Singapore has really good doctors, nurses, allied health professionals. We have access to the latest technologies. We've got bright young medical students, nursing students. The trouble is the financing system is a mess. And the result of which is that there's so many people who fall through the cracks. These are not cracks. These are gaping big holes in the system. And I've tried many ways of trying to provide feedback for this. In fact, Corbin Wan, when he was health minister, he used to have a minister's staff meeting with the senior leadership. And I've heard from two people that at one of those meetings, he told them, when Ministry of Health opened its Facebook page, the first doctor to comment on it was Paul Tambyah. So, in fact, I only joined Facebook because that was the only way that I could provide feedback to the Ministry of Health. They set up a website, but there was no feedback.
Right.
Then they set up their Facebook page, and I think Salma Khalek wrote in first, and I was the second one in. So I realized that, I've been to town hall meetings, and at these town hall meetings, they'll present their point of view, and then they'll look around and say, any questions? And then the PermSec or the director will say, Paul, any questions? And then I'll start asking a question, and then everybody else will ask some questions. But, they listen politely to you, and then that's it. You see, they don't make any changes because the decisions have already been made. And so I realized that the only way to really make a difference was to get into politics. Because when you get into parliament, you ask a question, they have to answer you. They don't always have to give you a straight answer. But we've had people like Peng Eng Huat and Yi Zhen Zhong who have kept on asking, and eventually you get an answer which is somewhat similar to what you're looking for.
Okay, but then does that actually achieve anything, getting an answer? So information really helps, but one of the challenges is how do you actually create change when all you can do really is stand up in Parliament and ask questions? So, another really common question then that we get is, well, we know the PAP is going to win. So what actually can the opposition achieve when the PAP can steamroller through anything with just 50% of the seats plus one, which they're going to have?
Right. Well, they're going to have a lot more than 50% plus one.
Way more,
In fact, there's a fear they're going to wipe out the opposition.
Yes.
So, but what we can do is we can get the information. See, because as you know very well, we don't have a Freedom of Information Act, and very often the information is trapped in some black box somewhere, in some file cabinet, in some encrypted file somewhere, and that's really bad for democracy. It's really bad for a functioning society, and it's really bad for science. It's really bad for public health, for public policy. And the PAP is really strange, and in many ways it tries to steamroller things. But there are certain things which are pain points, as they would say, where when the public becomes aware of something, then it's impossible for the PAP to move. The classic example which I brought up in Bukit Panjang, which is where I've been walking the ground. I've been walking around before because a large part of Bukit Panjang is part of Holland Bukit Timah, but that's another story. But in 2017, Corbyn 1 actually stood up and said that the Bukit Panjang LRT was an afterthought that was put in because of political pressure, and he said it was designed in a masochistic way. That quotation is there, September 12, 2017, Straits Times. Now I learned we have to quote chapter and verse. But he actually said that. And I talked to people in Bukit Panjang, and none of them will admit to putting political pressure on the Ministry of Transport to build an LRT. So somehow they just felt that there were obviously problems with transport. There was a new town coming up. There was only that one main road going through, and the Bukit Panjang Road, and then the Ring Road, and then the buses, and there was always jams and people moving in and out to Choa Chu Kang. And then they decided to build the LRT. But the information was not made available. And because the information was not made available, the policymakers themselves were blindsided. See, they did not realize what was the extent of the demand for the LRT, what were the options. And in fact, in conversation just a couple of days ago, I was talking to someone else about the MRT. And you know this, the MRT, when it was first developed, the government actually invited competing teams of experts from Harvard and some other universities, and they presented the two alternatives on TV. I was young, but I was interested at that time, and I think I must have been in secondary school. And so there was the all-bus approach versus the MRT. And they even had a public disagreement between politicians from the ruling party.
I think Toh Chai wanted the all-bus option.
I think it was Tony Tan who wanted the all-bus approach, and Ong Teng Cheong wanted the MRT.
So Toh Chai retired by then.
That's right. So there was a public disagreement, and there were the experts giving the pros and cons on both sides. And then, of course, the decision was made. Who knows how it was made, but it was made. And you can imagine what it'd be like if we had an all-bus system today. It would have been a complete disaster. So I think that's the value of 11 opposition members of parliament from the SDP in parliament. So you can be sure we're going to ask questions. And when we ask questions, it's going to force the government to reveal some of the thinking behind the policy decisions. And it would actually help the policy decisions, because then they'll realize, hey, there are not that many people in Bukit Panjang who want a crazy LRT which is going to break down all the time and things like that. And the cost-benefit equation becomes a more clearly understood one.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. And also, I think what I found is that when you get the ministers to say things and put them on the record, we can then hold them accountable. Whereas if no one asks the question, then they can then change the story later. They don't have to commit themselves to any position or explain their thinking.
That is true.
But I think another thing though is what people are very frustrated by also is, okay, so you can ask questions, but how exactly would the opposition want to change anything? And I think the SDP has articulated perhaps the clearest difference of opinion with the PAP, but for our audience, could you tell us what actually is your vision, the SDP's vision for Singapore, and how is that different from the People's Action Party's vision?
Well, thanks. The SDP's vision is radically different from the PAP's vision. And part of it is because of the fundamental principles and the fundamental values. We believe that certain things are fundamental basic rights, economic rights, human rights. And I'll take the field which I'm most familiar with, which is healthcare. See, the SDP believes that healthcare is a basic human right. and that nobody should be denied basic healthcare because they can't afford to.
Right.
See, and the PAP pays lip service to that, in that there are safety nets. But the safety nets are available for the very poor. And you get people who slip through the cracks, who are not poor enough to enjoy the safety net benefit. And then you get situations where well-meaning social workers tell them, you know, you've got to become a little bit poorer, then you can get the benefit, see, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
See, and this is not a Singaporean invention. See, what it is this is unfortunately the neoliberal view of healthcare, which sees healthcare not as a public good, but as a commodity.
Yeah.
And you know, as I tell academics who come into Singapore, they're so impressed by what they see. And then they see people with, you know, 50-year-olds who are going blind with amputations from diabetes, which is not well controlled. And they say, how can this happen in Singapore? And I say, well, you know, they have to pay up front for their consultations. There's a co-payment, there's deductibles, and they get limited amounts of paid time off. And they say, that's crazy. That's what we have in America. I say to them, you know, unfortunately, Singapore seems to be determined to repeat every mistake of US healthcare financing of the last 20 years.
Right.
So instead of looking to Taiwan and Korea, which are very successful universal healthcare systems, you know, the neoliberal agenda is driving the healthcare financing system. And that's frustrating. It's frustrating to me, it's frustrating to so many others, to patients, to healthcare workers, to professionals and academics alike.
Okay, but the obvious response to that is how would you handle costs, right? Healthcare is something where no one ever, if the costs are not restrained, no one ever restrains themselves from consuming healthcare. You always need more healthcare. As someone who lived in the UK a long time, I love the NHS. I had all my treatments for free there. I have a chronic skin condition, right? And it was great working with them, but the costs were always an issue, and the challenge of restraining these costs was something that every government has tried to address in very, very different ways, some with greater success, some with greater failure. So how would you restrain costs?
Yeah, there's a one-word answer to that, and then there's a more detailed one. The one-word answer, unfortunately, is rationing.
Rationing,
you know? And rationing is a term that's used by neoliberals all the time to try and tar the whole approach of universal healthcare. And it's as you say, when you're providing a universal public good, you know, you cannot provide a Rolls Royce to everybody. You see, so the question is what is the level of healthcare that you're willing to provide. Now, the more detailed answer actually comes from Uwe Reinhardt from Princeton, who recently passed away. And he made this argument that healthcare is like a three-legged stool. There are three parts to it. There's excellence, there's efficiency, and there's equity. And they said there's no healthcare system in the world which has all three. The United States has excellence and efficiency, but no equity. So you got really good healthcare, it's really fast, you get an MRI scan within an hour, you know, but you pay through your nose. And there are 40 million uninsured. The UK has got excellence and equity, but no efficiency. You know, you wait forever for your appointment, right? But it's got some of the top hospitals in the world. It's got really good surgeons. You know?
And it's free at,
and
the,
it's
point
free
of
at the point of care.
So no one ever has to worry about accessing healthcare. And that to me is such a psychologically such an important step, to know that you're never going to be denied healthcare.
Exactly. So Singapore unfortunately has a little bit of each. See, so we have some pretty good excellence, we have some pretty decent efficiency, and we have sort of like halfway there equity. And in Singaporean terms, what this is actually it's cheaper, better, faster. You know, you can only be cheaper and better, but you can't be faster. See, or you can be cheaper and faster, but you can't be better. So ultimately, it comes down to values. See, the United States as a society is, you know, this pioneering idea, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, rugged individualism. So for them, efficiency and excellence are important. If you don't get it, it's because you're weak, you're lazy, you know, you don't deserve that kind of healthcare. And that's the pushback against Obamacare. And unfortunately, in Singapore, there's a strain which is tending towards that. See that, you know, you hear the stories of all these PAP candidates who pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, who all had these really humble backgrounds, you know, and then and then they did so well and became CEOs of multinational corporations. You see, the implication is, if I can do it, you can't. You know, I use this as a Michael Jordan example. You see, if you grow up in North Carolina in a ghetto, and if you're not a multimillionaire by the time you're 35, then there's something wrong with you.
Right.
You know, which is crazy, you
Yeah.
see. But that's the kind of argument that people use.
Yeah.
And whereas in the UK, the values are completely different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a way, the extreme version, I haven't lived in the UK for long enough, but my UK friends joke about the mediocrity which is sort of encouraged, you know, the tall poppy sort of, you don't want the guy who's too proud and too outstanding, and you know, it's always understated and
Okay,
you know, that kind of approach.
Okay, let's talk about values though, because this is really, really important, and I think this is something which is never discussed enough. What would you say are the fundamental values of the SDP, and how does that differ from the PAP? Now, we've kind of answered some of that already,
Right.
but can you go a bit deeper into your vision of a society in terms of the values that underpin it and how that distinguishes it from the PAP?
Right. So, you know, basically the excellence part of it, or rather the competency,
Yeah.
you know, that is a no-brainer. We all agree on that. See, that is something that Singapore has a reputation for, providing high standards, and that's something that we share completely. It's just the way you get there.
Uh-huh.
You know, and the PAP is deeply entrenched in this idea of the natural aristocracy.
Right.
And this actually goes back to the eugenic views that were popularized in the 1970s and 80s. You know, the idea that some people are intrinsically better than others, and you've got to find out who these some people are. And then you've got limited resources. In fact, it used to be on the GEP homepage under the Ministry of Education's website. There's actually, I took a screenshot of it.
Okay.
It said that Singapore is a small country with limited resources, so we have to concentrate on those who have the potential to do really well, and that's why the GEP tries to identify the brightest students and nurture them.
Right.
You know, that's kind of Orwellian in a way.
Yes.
Yeah. And whereas the SDP's approach is the opposite to
Okay.
that. You know, we believe that every child has the potential to do well.
Okay.
Not every child is going to be an Einstein.
Right.
But, you know, every child is going to be really good at what they are good at doing.
Okay.
And, you know, some children have children with disabilities. My mom, as you know, has,
Yes.
she knows your mom very well.
Yes, yes, they work
and
together
both,
in the
exactly,
charity
AWA,
unit,
yeah.
yes.
And, you know, she has always felt that every child has the right to an education. She was one of the big movers of the compulsory education for children with disabilities.
Right.
And that every child has the right to live out their potential. It may not be the same for every child, and it most certainly is not going to be the same. And in fact, one of the strongest memories I have of visiting the school, the special school which she started, was on the end of year concert. And these kids are so disabled. You know, some of them can barely move their hands or just lift their eyebrows. And the teachers were there putting together these items and having these musical things. And the parents are there taking pictures of the kids, you know, just like a kid in a normal kindergarten.
Right.
And it was just so heartwarming. You see, the idea that, you know, a child even with such a severe disability has the potential to appear on stage, you know, and make the parents happy.
So you'd say then what characterizes the SCP and how it drives your policies is this value of inherent dignity and equality of, how would you you know,
well, it's a
characterize
kind
it?
of egalitarianism,
Yeah.
and it's also a recognition that, you know, that we're all the same. See, and these are things that are actually in our national pledge. You know,
Yes.
to build a democratic society
Yes.
based on justice and equality. That's
Yes.
it, you see. I mean, we say this every day in school. You
Yeah.
know, we say it really fast so we can't maybe catch the words.
Yeah.
But
I've
that's
been
it. see?
told, like, people, you know, online trolls have been like, oh, don't bring in democracy, it's a Western invention. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what? Wait, it's in our pledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, we're supposed to achieve democracy.
Every school kid says it
Yes.
every day. Yeah.
Yes.
We used to say it every day. I don't know whether they still do. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I should ask my son.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, so applying this to your other policies, right? How would you, for example, what are your policy differences based on these values with, I think most Singaporeans are very focused on, or at least older ones, on CPF,
Right.
on the HDB. You've mentioned education and healthcare, right? And of course, sort of jobs or income employment. Can you talk a bit more about your party's position on this?
So, you know, yesterday the Prime Minister was talking about jobs, and so was
Yeah.
Vivian. And so we'll start with jobs.
Yeah.
Okay, so we believe that every job is intrinsically valuable. In fact, that's the interesting thing about the pandemic. You know, investment banking, you know, management consulting are not considered essential jobs. Whereas garbage collection, you know, plumbing, you know, those are considered essential jobs. And in certain countries, it's like that. You know, in Australia, when my dad was doing his postgraduate, he used to joke. He said it's harder to get to a plumber than to a doctor. And the plumbers are paid really well in Australia. It's the same in Japan. It's the same in Korea, where certain skilled professions attract a certain reward. In fact, Tommy Cole mentioned that. He compared bus drivers in Scandinavia with bus drivers in Singapore. And the gap between the salary of a bus driver and the salary of a banker is hugely different in Singapore versus Scandinavia. So the fundamental way to start dealing with this is through the minimum wage. And the minimum wage, it doesn't just raise the level of the so-called blue-collar worker in Singapore. But it actually raises the whole population, because what it does is it gives money into the pocket of the blue-collar worker. So the blue-collar worker is able to afford the resources for his or her children, and then you have the social mobility kick in. You know, there's all this talk from the neoliberal world that, you know, minimum wage will cost jobs. You see, but if a job is only going to be sustainable if it pays below a living wage, it's not a job that's worth having. And what happens in countries which have minimum wage? Okay, look at the countries which have minimum wage in Asia. You've got Hong Kong, you've got Japan, you've got Taiwan. You know, these are countries which are right at the top, you know, compared to countries which do not have minimum wage. See, you've got Laos, Cambodia, you know, where you can pay people pennies.
Right.
So the fact is that when you have a minimum wage, you're forcing the bosses to modernize, to use technology, to improve productivity. So otherwise they'll go out of business. And it is true. In that situation, the minimum wage may drive some people out of business, but perhaps these are the people who should go out of business in the first place. So this is where the minimum wage comes in the first place. It's for the local workers. And in the second place, which we feel very strongly about, is a minimum wage is also a way to stop the exploitation of migrant workers. And this is something that's really come home with the pandemic. You know, I've been to the dorms and they're really sad places. You know, it's so hot, it's so crowded, it's just you know, intolerable in many of the dorms.
Okay, so address directly then the obvious PAP criticism, which is always that, and you've touched on it a bit, this will drive up living costs. This will price Singapore out of, you know, it will make us less globally competitive, because one of the things that the PAP is terrified by is what happened with the second industrial revolution in the 80s, right? We both lived through that. I was much younger than you, of course, where there was a massive recession. Because the last time the PAP tried to impose wage floors and raise wages, and they declared that our developmental era is over, we're going to be a high income, high value production country, right? And they, in some ways, Goh Keng Swee and Lee Kuan Yew foresaw the sort of the shift in the global economy and saw where Singapore needed to go to be a place where we generate capital to invest elsewhere rather than a place which is relying on foreign capital coming in. But it was a huge failure because it was done too quickly, too fast. It led to a big recession. And that has made the PAP extremely gun-shy ever since, right? They've not been willing to do anything more than tweak the economy, but not move from this low-wage manufacturing and services model. So how would you respond to this challenge?
Yeah, you know, in a way, the pandemic is a way that's going to deal with this. See, it's going to force them to realize that you cannot continue with business as usual. See, you know, it's really sad. On the way here, I was driving behind a truck, and there were 6 migrant workers in the truck, and I was telling my wife, look, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. You know, that's really sad. But I think something is going to have to change. You know, it may. I'm just hoping it was just that truck and that company. You know, but the reality is, as you correctly point out, see, in the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee recognized that Singapore could not continue with the sweatshops forever. And we've seen that. You know, China is no longer producing T-shirts en masse. It's moved to Bangladesh, you know, and to Guatemala, or to Saipan and places like that. And so it's just a matter of time before the global economy is going to shift. And city-states like Singapore are going to move into, you know, what we're already doing, banking services, high-end services, and stuff like that. But, you know, the SDP is not looking at it from the point of view of the top-down, you know, large-scale policy change. See, and this again is the difference between the SDP and the PAP, is that we have confidence in Singaporeans. See, and we think that if you start freeing up the economy and you stop micromanaging things, trying to dictate, okay, we see this in the university. At one point in time, engineering was really hot. Then everybody who got straight A's went into engineering. Then all of a sudden now, data analytics is really hot. You can read this online. The university publishes the indicative grade point average of people who get into, so 5 years ago, you needed 3 A's to get into, say, electrical engineering, whereas you could get into computer science with 2 B's and a C. Right. Now you need 3 A's to get into computer science. Right. You can get into engineering with 2 B's and a C. So this is the top-down, driving the policy approach, which is the hallmark of the PAP. See, a minister says, okay, we need data analytics. We throw in all the money into data analytics and we start going out from there. Whereas we think that Singaporeans have it within themselves. We've got a really good education system. We've got people who are exposed to the world. We've got people who are, everybody on the train is watching some Korean movie or other. And so they're not, confined to one way of thinking. See, even though we have a very repressive political system, but the entertainment world, the access to information is still there, fortunately, mostly. Outside of Singapore I'm talking about. I'm not talking about in Singapore. Any Singaporean can look at the official data from New Zealand or from Hong Kong or somewhere else to see and can study it in great detail. So what I think is going to happen is if 20 years from now and the SDP takes over and has the power to sort of free the economy, that Singaporeans will come up. And I'm not the only one saying that. There's this famous quotation from Guy Kawasaki from Apple. He compared Israel with Singapore. He said Israel has 5 million people, has 5 million opinions, it's got 5,000 startups. He said Singapore has 5 million people, it's got 1 opinion, it's got a handful of startups. So it's intricately linked. When you squeeze people, when you restrict their freedom of speech and freedom of expression, you're not just restricting the way they think about civil liberties, you're also restricting the way they think about solving problems, about coming up with the next, Apple or whatever. You see?
Yeah, I mean, they do say, Apple is inextricable from the sort of open culture of California.
Exactly, Northern California,
Valley, yes. Along those lines, right? I mean, I'm a small business owner. I have employees across Southeast Asia. And one of the things that I worry about is the fact that we're all freelance.
Right.
And one of the things that I felt very, unhappy with, something that Vivian and also Prime Minister said, is that their focus of welfare is through jobs. But that is predicated on 2 things, one of which we've addressed, the idea that someone's inherent value is economic, right, and measured economically. But the other is this idea of a job in the 21st century being the same as a job in the 20th century, where you have a fixed workplace, where you have a fixed employer, where you're going to an office, where you're in the same country as your as your employer, and there are formal legal arrangements, regulatory arrangements which can protect you. How should we cope with the gig economy where many of us are working actually freelance without legal protection, without labor protections for organizations? Some of them are in the same country, some of them are elsewhere. How do we cope with that changing nature of work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that governments all over the world are wrestling with, because the gig economy is not unique to Singapore. I mean, it's even in Northern California, they're struggling with this issue of how do you protect workers within the gig economy. But the whole idea of work has also changed with the pandemic. People are still not going to work, even though they've loosened the restrictions in Singapore. And I mean, the traffic is still really good, and the ridership on the MRT is still nowhere near what it was before the lockdown. So it's got to be some time before we figure out how to do it. And this is actually the time to have voices in Parliament, because legislation is going to come out. And the question is whether the legislation is going to protect the employer or whether it's going to protect the employee. And this came about with, like, for example, the job support scheme. See, the job support scheme pays employers. In other countries, the money is given to, the employers are allowed to give their workers no pay leave, but the government pays the salary to the worker, direct to the worker. Okay. So that is actually more targeted. And I think you've seen MOM has actually uncovered various nefarious ways that people are making use of the job support scheme.
Yeah.
Because job support scheme is tied to CPF.
Yeah.
And there are some people who just get CPF but don't work. You know, there are various scams that are out there that MOM is aware of and that they're trying to crack down on.
Right.
I'll give you an example. A patient of mine had a stroke, and he was going to go home, and they were trying to figure out how he was going to get himself supported. And then his friend comes up to him and says, oh, no issue. Coffee shop downstairs will employ you. They'll pay your CPF. Then they can hire 5 foreign workers because you're the local person and they can meet the quota. I said, that's crazy. I'm going to report you. He said, no, please don't. I said, you know, you're going to get found out one day. And he said, everybody's doing it. I said, no, they can't be. Yeah, I'm sure the MOM has a way of figuring it out.
Right.
But you see, these are the kind of people, if you have somebody, MOM actually specifically addressed this.
Yeah.
They said, if we find out that you're paying CPF on somebody who doesn't even set foot on your, in your premises,
Yeah.
then, you know, not only are you not going to get the job support, we're going to crack down and arrest you for fraud.
Wow.
So, but that's a kind of intrinsic problem that happens
Okay.
if you put the money in the hands of the employer
Okay.
versus putting the money in the hands of the employee.
Okay. So I agree on all that, right? But you're not really addressing the issue of those of us who then don't, because of the contracts that we're working on, because either, you know, we're freelancers where we have to self-declare or do all this paperwork. We don't formally fall under many of these protections, or we work for foreign companies. And one solution that has been proposed, for example, is universal basic income,
Right.
so that it's your welfare is uncoupled from your job, right? What's the SDP's position on this? Do you still see the job as fundamental to, you know, the sort of long-term, I'm trying not to use the word welfare, but
Yeah, well-being, I guess.
well-being,
Yeah.
and also as a the formal job as a cornerstone of the economy, or would you uncouple income from work?
Yeah,
What's your
that's
vision
a
there?
really intriguing question. You know,
Yeah.
and I am aware that there have been trials of universal basic income, and there have been some issues with it. And I think it's probably because we haven't quite got the formula right.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the SDP's program for seniors,
Yeah.
which is $500 every month for the bottom 80% of seniors, and the idea is that, you know, you don't want to have a senior citizen living out his last days picking up cardboard or cleaning toilets. You see. And you want to give them the freedom to hang out with their mahjong kakis, or to look after their grandchildren, or go for walks in the park and things like that.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that if we start with that cohort, and then we move on to our retrenchment insurance, which provides a proportion of the last drawn salary for a young person. And the idea is that you're not just supporting this young person and helping them to just, you know, stay at home and play Warcraft or something like that.
Yeah.
But actually what you're doing is you're encouraging a few of them to get together and start a business.
Mm-hmm.
So the young people actually have the potential to use, if they had a buffer, and that's the idea behind universal basic income, is it gives you a buffer.
Mm-hmm.
So you're willing to take a risk. You know, if you had, say, $1,500 a month, and then you know that, you know, you could pay whatever your mortgage is, or you're still staying with your parents and you could still give some money to them, then you have a little bit of extra cash, but you could take the risk and set up something that addresses a problem or a need in society and in the economy. And I think that's where we need to go. See? And you're quite right. You know, I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, everybody lived at home and worked at home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then they started moving to the cities, and then the dark satanic mills, and you know, and then you had to have football to entertain the workers on the weekends. But you know, coming back specifically to the gig economy, and you know, the SDP is a social democratic party.
Yes.
And the solution is ultimately unionization.
Yeah.
You see, it's got to be collective action.
Right.
You know, it's got to be getting together with like-minded people. And you know, I see this in my own field. You know, the drug company comes up to us and they say, okay, we'll offer you a special deal. You know, you put in this number of patients in. I'll say, wait a minute, I'll get back to you. Then I call up my friend at SGH. What kind of deal are they offering you? I call up somebody in Tan Tock Seng. And then we all get together, and this is where information is key. See?
Mm-hmm.
If you're willing to share the information, and then you can see, then I turn around to the company and say, hey, you're offering them this deal. You know, why are my patients not getting that kind of deal?
Yeah, I think we saw that in the US where hospitals were
Exactly.
resisting publishing the prices.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the things that Trump did, because under Obamacare, you see, they were allowed to negotiate in bulk,
Yeah.
you know, and then he actually tried to take that away.
Right.
So the divide and rule is the oldest trick in the colonialist book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. If I can ask you a tough question, immigration,
Okay.
right? And I think that there has been a feeling that a lot of the opposition parties are veering close to xenophobia.
Right.
And there's been questioning of, why do we need so many low-wage foreign workers, which is valid, but then there has also been, this idea, of course, of Singaporeans above others.
Right.
Right. Can you talk about the SDP's position on this? What is your vision for immigration? And then, of course, also Sun Juan, Dr. Chi pinned down Vivian specifically on the 10 million and 6.9 million issue.
Right.
Right. So what is your vision for immigration and the role of non-Singaporeans in our country, in our society, in our economy going forward?
Yeah, those are very good questions. And let me start with these 10 million and 6.9 million. Just before getting here, I was on the phone with Sun Juan, and he pointed me to Sudhir Vadaketh's blog, where he actually gave the backstory behind this whole 10 million and 6.9 million thing. And it's really fascinating because the 10 million came out from a Straits Times report in March 2019 of a forum that Heng Swee Keat did at NTU. And so Sudhir dutifully reported it, and in that report, the Straits Times had mentioned that Mr. Heng had mentioned Liu Thai Ker's 10 million population. But Sudhir had a back and forth with the DPM's office, and ultimately the DPM's office provided him with the transcript of what actually happened.
Oh, okay.
And what was interesting is that DPM Heng didn't mention the 10 million at all. So it was the Straits Times which extrapolated from DPM Heng talking about Liu Thai Ker and the fact that Liu Thai Ker had recently talked about a 10 million population.
Oh,
But that only came out after the event. And how are we to know what's happening behind the scenes between the Straits Times and the DPM's office? So we just take the Straits Times, as you know, which is supposed to be the provider of truth,
the newspaper
of record. And so we took that and we ran with that. And 10 million, frankly, from an infectious disease point of view, the one lesson of the pandemic is overcrowding is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So if you have 10 million people on this crowded island, it's clearly a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And so when Sun Juan brought that up, Vivian rapidly denied it and tried to, and now the PMO has denied it.
They only denied it yesterday morning,
I know,
think,
which
right?
is really interesting. Yeah. No, they denied it, I think, after the debate. I'm not sure what the timing was.
But it was
around the same
unfair
time.
to ask Sun Juan to know that the PMO
exactly.
had denied it when it had just come out. Yeah.
But anyway, that's actually the whole point of this.
Yeah.
We don't bring up an argument just to win an argument.
Yeah.
We bring up an argument because we think it's wrong to have 10 million people on this island. So in fact, I told Sun Juan we won. we had 5 points in our campaign. Now we've only got 4 to fight for.
Right.
And this must be some kind of record. Even before we get elected, we've already achieved one of our goals of our campaign. We've got the government to deny a 10 million population. And he said to me, look, don't be so optimistic. He said they're going to play a switcheroo on us. I said, yeah, okay, fair enough. So that actually is they've done that before again and again and again. Yeah. So that's the whole point. We have to elect opposition members into parliament so that you can hold them to what they've said. So now they've said, okay, 10 million is not on the agenda. And this is the government which argued that 200 meters from a polling station is not the same as being within 200 meters from a polling station. So maybe they mean it's actually 10 million is not on the agenda, but 9.99 million is on the agenda. So you've got to be there in Parliament to ask the questions, to say, okay, you said 10 million is not. Are you also going to say 9.99 is not on the agenda? Right. And what was interesting is in the transcript, which is in Sudhir's blog, he actually mentions that somebody tried to pin him down, one of the NTU students, to a number. Yeah. And he said it has to be a discussion. Right. And I agree. It has to be a discussion. So let's start that discussion. See, what is the optimum population for Singapore? for, and there's so many factors that go into this. If you're doing low-wage manufacturing, you need a large population base. But if you're doing high-end skills or gig economy where people are working from their homes and coming up with creative things, you don't need a huge number of people.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you for a specific number, obviously.
Sure.
But again, the question, right, is always, we know what the SDP will fight against,
right,
but what will the SDP fight for? And what is your vision of Singapore and our future and our society and the role of foreigners?
Very good.
Yes.
Actually, I do have a number.
Okay,
it's just personal. It's not the SDP. Okay, don't quote me on that.
Okay.
My number is 4 million. And the reason why I quote that number,
is that Singaporeans and PRs?
everybody,
okay.
all the people on the island. And the reason why I quote that number is every time there's a long weekend, my wife and I, we don't go overseas.
Right.
You see, because we estimate that 1.5 million people have left the country.
Right.
Then all of a sudden you can go to the mall, you can go to the shop, you can get into a restaurant, you can watch a movie, So when and we don't have kids, so school holidays, you got another 1 million people leaving the country.
Yeah.
So I think about 3-4 million, that would be just right for Singapore.
Okay.
But again, that's a personal view from my wife and I.
Okay, but your vision. What
so
is
my
this
vision
vision?
actually
Yes.
is a vision where everybody is treated the same.
Okay.
And this goes down to the migrant worker population, see.
Right.
What is it that makes a company hire an IT professional from, say, the Philippines or India against somebody who is a poly graduate from Singapore? See, and ultimately, if you talk to them, they'll say, oh, the poly graduate is more demanding. I say, yeah. So what is he demanding? Oh, he's demanding a $3,000 salary. Yeah. Does he have parents to look after? Does he have is he going to get married? Yeah. How much do you think that's going to cost? But he's demanding. This actual conversation took place a week ago. Right. He says, that's why, so I asked him, he works in an IT company, and he says, I asked him how many other Singaporeans are there. He said, well, there's only one other guy, he's a former Malaysian. I said, how many people do you have? He said, we got 15 of them. Where are they from? 5 are from Philippines, 6 are from India, and 2 of them from Myanmar and somewhere else. So I said, are they really that good? He said, well, they're good. I said, is the poly guy worse than them? No. Then why are you hiring them? Because they're willing to work for $2,500 a month. And that is exploitation. It's exploitation of the Filipino guy because he's doing work which should be paid $3,000 or $3,500 a month. But the market is spoiled by the fact that there's so many of them who are willing to work for $2,500 a month. Okay. And he's forced to live, these guys, 4 of them share an apartment or 6 of them share an HDB apartment, And they work really hard. They work overtime because they come here for a few years, they make enough money, they go home. Yeah. So during that time, which they should be spending with their families, they should be bringing up their children. They should be, getting to start families or looking after their elderly parents. So it's the exploitation, which it's a whole ecosystem.
Okay. So just to be clear, the Myanmar guy or the Indian guy are actually also in Singapore.
They're in Singapore.
They're not located in
they're not
Yangon
located in Yangon or anywhere. They're actually located in Singapore. They're S-Pass holders, you see, who are here, who are brought in, and this is where the problem comes in, because the company has to, my friend is the Singaporean guy. He gives the company a quota. So because they've employed a Singaporean, so they're allowed to hire a certain number. And in certain industries, there's no quota as well. Right. So effectively, it's a race to the bottom, and everybody suffers. See, so now the poly guy can't get a job in this guy's company because my friend thinks he's too demanding. So what does he do? He ends up becoming a real estate agent or a Grab driver. And even though he may make more money, but the job is less secure. It's essentially the gig economy all over. I mean, the poor real estate agents, nobody's buying houses at a time like this. Yeah. And you're very, very dependent on the other parts
So the
of the
PAP's argument would be, well, these people make us more competitive.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
Yeah, but we don't want to compete on the basis of cost. See, we want to compete on the basis of excellence, of quality, of responsiveness, and above all, in terms of location and connectivity. See, Singapore was actually the center for the League of Nations Health Organization from the 1930s. That was the predecessor of the World Health Organization. They had 2 centers, one in Geneva and one in Singapore. And the reasons they gave were the geographical location of Singapore and the fact that it was connected by telegraph to every major Asian capital. So they kept track of epidemics occurring on ships in Jakarta, in Cochin, China, in Bangkok. And it was funded by Japan, who obviously wanted to get some intelligence, I'm sure, about Singapore, and the other countries within the region. So Singapore has this competitive advantage. We're right in the middle of two oceans.
Mhm.
Again, I don't have to tell you that.
Yeah.
But you know, the fact is that we have always been at the crossroads. You know, we want to hold a webinar. We hold it at 7 o'clock in Singapore, which is just nice. It's the middle of the day in Europe. It's early in the morning in the US. You know, even with all these restrictions on travel and stuff like that, we're still in the right place. See, so we have that advantage. And we have a background, you know, we have the head start with the development, with the technology and all that kind of thing going for us.
Right.
So,
But we don't have leverage, right? We don't have a strong class of local domestic capital to take up the slack. Because the argument again and again is almost 50% of our GDP comes from foreign-owned companies. If we raise the cost, they will all leave because they're foreign-owned companies. They don't have to be here. Our foreign investment will decline. And then there will be no jobs, there'll be economic disaster. And unlike China, you brought up, you know, we brought the Asian tigers, they've all developed strong domestic capital class to give them leverage and to, as a buffer when foreign capital, foreign investment goes away. This was part of our disaster in the 80s. And we, for various reasons, right, including because of the fact that local capitalists tended to vote against the PAP and organize against the PAP, right, they were severely curtailed, suppressed. And so we're in a situation where we don't have enough leverage. So the argument again and again will be, if you want to raise salaries and pay people living wages, it's going to then affect everyone because it'll destroy the economy because all these companies will leave and they're almost 50% of GDP.
Yeah, you know, that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Is that we had a situation where we had local capital.
Yes.
Yeah, but they were all anti-PAP, or the majority of them were anti-PAP.
Yeah, the Chinese-speaking merchants.
And so they ended up getting chopped. So we need to get back to that, you know, and I think this is what's going to happen with the opening up. I mean, what could have happened if we didn't have a pandemic election where they're going to do a wipeout, you know? If we had a normal election and we had the trajectory that we had, you know, in 2006, 2011, the by-elections of 2012, 2013, it was with, of course, the 2015 freak election with the memory of Lee Kuan Yew. But we were moving along a trajectory with more loosening and opening up. And then, of course, we have the pandemic, and now they're calling an election where people are going to do a flight to safety. So we're moving backwards. But you know, history doesn't always, you know, move in a predictable fashion. And I think the reality is that the world is changing. The pandemic has changed the world. Things are happening around us in Southeast Asia. I mean, you know probably much better than I do what's happening in Indonesia with the startups. I mean, it's just remarkable that the number of startups that are coming up after the end of the new order.
The population is under 21.
Exactly.
And there's so much energy and vibrancy. I love going to Jakarta just because of the sheer chaos and energy of the place.
Well, I hate the traffic there.
That's the problem.
Well, the MRT, big thing.
Yeah, but it really doesn't seem like we should be relying on other countries to screw up in order for us to do well, you know?
Exactly, and you know, again, I mean, I hate to use this example, but some of the best match fixers in the world are from Singapore. You know, these are guys who grew up in Sembawang, and you know, they were petty gangsters in Sembawang, and now they're fixing matches in Italy, in Finland, in Hungary. You know, so Singaporeans have the creativity, they just need it channeled in the right direction. You see, you don't go and screw up the Serie A matches, you know, you just come up with something that will benefit kids, that will benefit, you know, society as a whole, rather than destroy the game of soccer.
Okay, all right, we're running out of time, so I'm going to just ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to take some questions. And I think the first question is specific to you, right? The pandemic. How would you have handled things differently?
Yeah.
How, you know, what do you think was done right? What do you think was done wrong? I suppose more specifically, what do you think was done wrong? How would you have handled it differently? You're going to be chair of the
International Society for Infectious Disease.
Which, I mean, is incredible. In the middle of pandemic, they pick you of all people to run the society. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Well, you know, the way Singapore ran the pandemic in January and February was almost perfect. See? And that's the way it should have been done all the way through. See, where there was a strong emphasis on public health, there was contact tracing, there was development of testing, there was development of technology. The one thing that concerned me in January and February was that the ministerial committee was taking the front and center of the role. And this was different from SARS. In SARS, there was a ministerial committee, but the ministerial committee was in the background.
Right.
And you had the scientists and public health people in the front. And in January and February, when things were working relatively well and things were moving smoothly, it was kind of okay if the politicians wanted the limelight. Okay, fine. That's a politician. They want to claim the credit.
Yeah.
But when things started going south, you really needed the experts to come in, and to be able to overrule the ministerial committee. A lot of people have recognized that probably the turning point was when Ministry of Manpower issued a statement. There was a cluster of workers at the Seletar Aerospace,
Yeah.
and MOH did a really good job. They went and did contact tracing, they quarantined all the contacts of the workers, they isolated the infected cases, they treated them, they tested them, and the cluster ended. It was just 5 Bangladeshi workers in February who were involved in a construction site. They lived in a dormitory, but they screened the dormitory, they cleared everything out, and they kept it really well under control. Now what happened was, a lot of the employers started getting nervous. And they say, hey, I've got a bunch of workers living in my dormitory. Shall I send them for testing? And then Ministry of Manpower threatened the employers. And they said, if you send your workers for testing with no good reason, or if they're, without a doctor getting some kind of authorization, that you will be penalized and you will lose your employment privileges.
And what was the rationale for threatening?
They were worried the testing would be overwhelmed. At that time, we could only do a few hundred tests a day.
Okay.
So again, it's like this mask thing. You see, the mask, they wanted to prioritize them for the healthcare workers, and they wanted to prioritize the tests for those who are travelers or those who are perceived to be at high risk. And again, this statement came out of MOM. It didn't come out of the public health community, where they said, we're going to penalize you if you start testing your workers.
Okay.
And so, as a result of which, the Ministry of Health was blindsided. They were not aware until it really exploded.
To use a word you used earlier, rationing, right? If you're saying that limited masks, limited testing, then what should the alternative have been?
Yeah, so the alternative should be getting the experts in to determine how you prioritize these things.
Okay.
See, rather than make it from a political or policy decision based on, the squeaky wheel, who makes the most noise and who gets the priority attention. It is not easy, you're right, but at the same time you need to ramp up capacity, which they did. Now we're running 12,000 cases tests a day, and the target is 40,000. See, but at that point in time, when the capacity was limited, the recognition, and again, they say it's easy to be wise after the event, but I have 2 articles which I've written where I mentioned that, nursing homes, foreign worker dormitories in February, that they were the ones that we need to really watch out for.
Yeah.
Because the people are in such cramped conditions.
And of course, NGOs have been pointing out the cramped conditions
for a long time.
For a long time.
And it's not as if this is the first time it's happened.
Yeah.
Last year we had a measles outbreak.
Right. Yeah.
In S11 dormitory, which is the same dormitory that got hit worse by the COVID outbreak. And measles is fortunate. There's a vaccine. There's a really good vaccine that works. So they had a measles outbreak. Again, good public health. They identified the cases. They vaccinated thousands of workers. Right. And they rolled it out and they stopped the outbreak. See,
but they didn't ask what was the underlying cause behind the fact.
No, they didn't. This is the this is the issue. You deal with you plug the hole in the dike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How much time do we have? Okay, so a last question, I guess, which is the other obvious question that people are asking: why Bukit Panjang? And I have to say to you, I am personally upset because I live in Ulu Pandan ward, which is where you ran 5 years ago, and that is where I was going to vote for you again, right? And I was very happy to be able to go around for 5 years saying, I voted for Paul Tambyah. I even said at the Go Chok Tong, and he didn't object. He tacitly accepted that's a good person to vote for, right? So why the shift from Holland Bukit Timah to Bukit Panjang?
Well, again, this is a decision that was made by the party, and actually, people don't realize this, but the SDP is truly a democratic party, and it was brought up a few weeks ago, not by Sun Chuan, by one of the other CEC members. He said, looking at the layout, the fact that Teo Ho Pin is going to retire, and Bukit Panjang actually is right next to Holland Bukit Timah. In fact, it's really bizarre. The town of Bukit Panjang is bisected somewhat arbitrarily. Gangsa Road. Some blocks are in Holland Bukit Timah, some blocks are in Bukit Panjang. Right. A large part of Holland Bukit Timah is not, the landed property. It's actually Bukit Panjang Estate, the Zhenghua part of Bukit Panjang Estate. Yeah. So we had been walking the ground in that area for a long time. And like many times we cross over and we're not sure whether we're in Holland Bukit Timah or in Bukit Panjang.
Right.
Again, that's the trouble with the Election Boundaries Committee that's part of the Prime Minister's office and
yes.
gerrymandering and all that. So the suggestion was that at a time when, Teo Ho Pin is very strong.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been there for a long time. He was a leader, he was a mayor or something like that. So he had a lot of resources to dispose. So the thinking was that, when he was stepping down, see whether we should reevaluate how we distributed the individuals that we had between Holland Bukit Timah and Bukit Panjang. And I actually abstained from the decision. We took a vote.
Okay.
And the consensus was that I should move to Bukit Panjang.
Okay.
And Bukit Panjang, like I said, it's not far away. It's right next door.
Yeah.
And it's a place which I was vaguely familiar with. I had cousins who lived there, and I had an aunt who was a GP in that area as well. But of course, it's changed completely. There's
everywhere in Singapore it's changed completely.
And I started doing walkabouts with Wai Yin, who had been walking the ground there a lot more in the past. And the response was very positive. People say, oh, we like Teo Ho Pin, but we don't know who's going to come in next, you see. So we felt that maybe this was an opportunity to give the voters a chance to see whether they felt that, we would be the right people to represent them. Okay. And ultimately the goal is to have the best fit for the voters, for the residents, and for the public.
So, okay, give you a pitch to the voters then.
Sure.
Why vote for you and not Liang Eng Hua?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I met Liang Eng Hua 3 times. In fact, today at MediaCorp, we bumped elbows again, and he said, look, it looks like we're going to have to do this every day for the next 9 days. And so he seems like a really nice person. But the thing is, he's one of 93, and what the voters of Singapore need is an alternative voice. And you can be sure that the SDP will provide an alternative voice. So we don't want to have a wipeout. We want to have an alternative voice in Parliament. And I think this is an opportunity to do that. So I hope the voters of Bukit Panjang, you can be sure that we'll run the town council the way we said we would. We will not involve a managing agent. Your town will be safe, clean, relatively dengue-free, and that's a problem right now. And we will deal with the issues as they come.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay, so some questions here.
Sure.
We have a question from Julian who asks, what made you choose to join the SDP over other parties?
Okay, that's very simple. I get asked that question a lot. In fact, some of my friends say, you've joined the wrong party. And I say to them, actually, the reason why I joined the SDP is I'm not hard up to be an MP. If I was hard up to be an MP, I'd have joined the PAP. I would have suppressed some of my views and just, I've got all the credentials, right? I'm professional, academic, etc., etc. Yeah. But I joined the SDP because I share their values. See, I believe in social justice. I believe in democracy. I believe in freedom of speech and expression. I believe that everybody has a right to education, to healthcare, no matter who you are and where you come from. And the SDP has clearly defined policies which reflect the ideology of the policy. So that's a no-brainer. SDP was the party for me.
And how do you address this impression that it's very much dominated by Dr. Chi, and how do you've mentioned it's a democratic party, how do you come up with policies, and how, what is it like working with Dr. Chi?
Yeah, so that's the trouble with politics in Singapore and in Asia in general. I mean, the PAP has been the party of Lee Kuan Yew for the last 30 years, essentially. Yeah. Even after he died, it was still the party of Lee Kuan Yew. He won the election for them, essentially in from the afterlife.
Yes. I did a video where I showed how often they still mention him so many times in Parliament last year, right? Every time they introduce him.
That's right. So that's the intrinsic nature of politics, I think, and not just in Singapore, in much of Southeast Asia as well. But the thing about the SDP, again, like I mentioned, even my decision to go to Bukit Panjang was something that he was not really that excited about. See, because he thought I could anchor the team in Holland Bukit Timah, and then of course it turned out we had good people as well who were made available. So he's not the dogmatic kind of leader. He's pretty stubborn, and his reputation
I think it's
is
quite clear he's very stubborn.
His reputation is there. He's the guy who doesn't get the putawong doll. You see, he keeps bouncing back up no matter what they throw at him. But it's interesting. During the Punggol East by-election lead up, my wife and I had lunch with him at the Penang place in 1 North. And after that lunch, I'll never forget this. You see, so I was walking off with my wife, and the thing she said to me was, "He's a normal person."
Yeah.
I said, yeah, he's a normal person. And she said the way the media portrays it, you'd expect him to be a psychopath.
Yeah.
In fact, that was
like
a term that was used. Yeah, devil's horns out
whatever.
there. So he's a normal person. He's got his weaknesses. He's a bit too stubborn sometimes, and but ultimately he's very passionate about what he believes in, and he's a firm believer in democracy, social justice, which are things that I believe in.
Okay, since you mentioned it, you mentioned alternatives came up. What's the story Thanji just suddenly dissolving his party and coming back to the SDP?
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, it's a bit of a gossipy question.
It is a bit of a gossipy question, and I have no, inside views. He's been keeping in touch with some of us over a period of time.
Yeah.
And he used this term at the press conference. It wasn't reported, but we were debating about whether to use it or not. He said you could look at it as a prodigal son returning, which I thought was very nice of him.
Right.
I mean, he was part of the so-called dream team in 2011 with Vincent Vijayasinghe and Michelle Lee.
Yes, I remember.
And Ang Yong Guan, who have all gone their different ways.
Yeah.
But he brings a lot to the table. He's got a PPE. He was PPS to Goh Chok Tong.
Yes.
And when it comes to issues like economics, I'm a complete amateur. I had to have a tutorial from him about this NIRC and how we're going to fund our programs, and he was very clear about it.
Yeah.
See, because he understands how the reserves work, about how the investment returns occur.
Right.
And that's something that we need. We're a bunch of idealistic activists.
Yes.
So we need somebody from the establishment, who's been there, who's handled the billions of dollars, and who knows what what happens when you have land sales and you have NIRC and all that kind of thing. So overall, I think the consensus was that he brings a lot to the table, and his heart is in the right place. As he said in his press conference, he's always standing up for the underdog.
Yeah.
That's the SDP.
I will say this for GSE. We had a conference on Singapore studies a few years ago, and I invited a whole bunch of people, including opposition politicians and people whom I thought would benefit from learning about Singapore. And it was in KL because we can't hold a conference on Singapore studies in Singapore because there's no academic freedom here. And of all these people I invited, some establishment, some opposition, activists, whatever, he was the only non-academic who showed up for the whole conference, was really engaged, fascinated by all the things we were discussing, and really took part in all these conversations.
Right.
And initially all these other academics were kind of taken aback that this guy had showed up. But once he started talking, we really engaged with him. He engaged with us, and he contributed a lot to the discussion.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt about it. I mean, he's a big thinker. He's a deep thinker, and he knows his stuff when it comes to economics. So, you can still vote for him.
Is he running in Ulu Pandan?
He is.
Okay.
He's in Holland Bukit Timah with James, Min,
but
and
specifically
and
in my ward or in the others?
Well, we don't believe in this divide and rule thing, you see. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
if by
the
some
GRC
miracle we
system
win, we can always make sure he goes to Ulu Pandan.
Okay, you don't designate before.
No, we don't designate before.
Okay,
we cover the whole area.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a question here. What's the least known thing about Dr. Chi that you feel people should know about? I've seen him shopping in Decathlon, which is as regular a Singaporean behavior as I know.
Well, I think some people know this. I don't know which is the websites it was that had the hulks of the 2020 general election, and everybody was under the age of 30 except for him. So he's a marathon runner, and he does triathlons.
Right.
So I think people don't realize that he's way fitter than I am. Yeah.
He looks very trim, very trim.
Yeah.
Okay, so marathon runner, triathlon, triathlete.
Triathlete, yeah.
Okay, so Terry, can you pull up the list of questions again? Where is that? How much time do we have left?
Now it's 1 minute 5.
Oh, okay. Let's take a real quick question then.
Okay, so we've seen many. Okay,
yeah, that's good.
So from Usirapati Supia Paul, what do you think of the government civil system in Singapore for the last 60 years? I feel the whole system has to be overhauled from the top to the bottom. So I think it's two different things, because he's talking about government and the civil service.
Yeah.
Which are, the civil service part of government, but there's the political, legislative wing, and then there's judiciary, there's civil service.
Yeah, I think he's talking more about the administrative side.
Okay.
And this is a good question because, Philip Yeo's comments about the eunuch syndrome have been going around. And a friend of mine actually interviewed Niam Tong Dao when he talked about the groupthink that exists in the civil service.
Right.
And I think it's all intrinsically tied in with the political culture, as you well know. See, what I said is that, when the SDP talks about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, we're not just talking about freedom to develop a new computer game or being an entrepreneur. We're also talking about freedom to think about alternative ways of addressing problems that society is facing, which is what the civil service does.
Yeah.
And, Lim Seong Guan wrote his book, and he described an incident which I thought was really striking. He said he was working in MINDEF, and Goh Keng Swee asked him to decide between Tank A and Tank B. And he was supposed to write a paper about Tank A and Tank B, and then he said, I prefer Tank A. Then he wrote the paper, gave it to Goh Keng Swee. And Goh Keng Swee said, actually, I prefer Tank B. Then he said, oh, shall I go back and rewrite the paper? Then Goh Keng Swee said, no, that's the whole reason why I asked you to write the paper, so I know what was the problem with Tank B. But, the civil service now, not everybody, but a significant proportion of them are trying to guess what their political masters want to hear. And so they write the paper trying to think, does the guy want Tank A or does the guy want Tank B? And then shall I write the paper to support, if I don't, I'm going to be finished. If I do, I'm going to get promoted. And this is a consequence of the high salaries, which is what Niam Tong Dao talked about, see, is that the walk-away cost is so high of being the dissident. I was asked a question a couple of days ago about whether I get any repercussions for being the opposition politician in academic and a professional situation. And I've said no, and I think I'm fortunate because I'm relatively senior, so I've got my tenure. I actually thanked Cherian George when I got my tenure. I said it's thanks to you that I think I got my tenure, But the interesting thing is that I get called to attend some meetings out of the blue. All of a sudden, the head of department can't go, or the deputy head can't go, and they say, "Can you go?" And I say, I'm sure there's something you want me to say that you dare not say.
Yeah.
And then invariably it is.
Yeah.
And so that's the trouble with the civil service is this groupthink and the idea that you don't want to do something different or innovative or risky because you risk losing a $500,000 job.
Right.
See, if your salary was not that high and you could move across to a strong local company run by some TOC or other, then you wouldn't mind coming out with a contrary opinion. You wouldn't mind saying that Bukit Panjang doesn't need an LRT of this kind at the time, But because there's this groupthink, which is fostered by a culture, a political culture, which says the guy at the top is always right. That the guys at the top are the natural aristocrats. They got the first class honors, they got the PS 275 in their PSLE, so therefore they're destined to lead us.
Okay, one last question. Can you stay for one last question?
Sure.
Because there's an informed question here from Muzamil who says, do you think coming from a minority race, this would be an uphill task? I suppose being an MP or being a political candidate, I think that's what he means, is an uphill task. How do you handle this?
I have no hesitation about this. And again, this is the thing. We need to give Singaporeans a bit more credit.
Yes.
Long before the GRC system was put in place, we had good representation of Malays and Indians in Parliament and Eurasians. Yeah. And this idea, there's only one political party in Singapore which thinks that a non-Chinese cannot be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
The leader of the opposition is a guy called Pritam Singh.
Yes.
Yes. So what do you think?
Our first chief minister was
a Baghdadi Jew.
Yes. Yeah. And then we had about 40% minorities in the 60s in Parliament.
Exactly.
And the reason why it declined was because the PAP got a clean sweep in 68 and it declined all the way. And then the first non-PAP MP elected after 68
was JB
JBJ, right.
Exactly. And he got re-elected in a ward which was even more ethnically Chinese than it was in 81.
And the MP he replaced? Devan Nair.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So Devan Nair was getting elected by all these, by a cross-section of Singaporeans.
Yeah.
So, and then JBJ. So I really don't see, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
But have you found, for example, you quite prominent wrote on Facebook how you felt insulted by having to get that certificate.
Yeah, I found that was really annoying.
Yeah.
And, hopefully, like I said, in 10 years' time, when we've got enough people to amend the Constitution or or to do away with this. The whole GRC thing will be done away with.
Yeah.
Because it just flies in the face of our daily lived experience.
Yeah.
Our daily lived experience, when you live and work with Singaporeans, they don't look at who you are, you know. Again, maybe I'm in an elite circle, okay? In certain circles, yes, they do. And it's really annoying when people speak in a language that other people don't understand.
Yeah.
But, you know, the bottom line is Singaporeans, I mean, look, the most popular PAP politician is Tharman Shanmugaratnam,
Yes.
you see.
Yes.
So I think this kind of thing is just a divide and rule strategy. See, and like I said, it's the oldest trick in the book of a colonialist or somebody who's trying to control a population, and Singaporeans are better than that.
Yeah. New Narrative has documented a lot of racial discrimination in Singapore, starting from the top, of course, because what is CMIO and the different ways you're treated in those boxes, then it is racial discrimination by definition. But then that trickles down into the broader public, and you see a lot of things like Indians or Malays not being able to rent flats, you know? Job ads saying things like
Mandarin speaking,
Mandarin speaking, right? But if you apply this, they go, oh, well, actually, we want a Chinese person, you know. So how would SDP tackle all of this, especially when the PAP's argument would be, oh, fragile racial harmony. If you start talking about these issues, it's going to lead, you know, the usual slippery slope. Right.
Yeah.
So
no,
what's
we
the
actually have addressed that. We have a Malay community paper that addresses that, and right at the core is the idea that discrimination should be illegal.
Yeah.
That there should be no discrimination on the basis of race, language, or religion in Singapore.
Or gender.
Or gender, exactly.
Yes.
And so that's right there in our policy. It's available on our website. You know, and obviously the Malay community is a community which suffers the most.
Yeah.
You know, and this kind of thing, like reserving the presidency for a Malay person or somebody who belongs to the Malay community who may not necessarily be Malay, but you know that is really cynical, because when we talk to so many of the Malay members of the SDP and Malay friends and colleagues, they'll tell you they would much rather have, you know, a reserved Malay number in the Air Force or in the Navy, you know, rather than in the presidency. I mean, who cares about the presidency? With all due respect, it's an important titular position, but in terms of a daily life, in terms of the chances for their children to do well, you know, they'd much rather have the Air Force scholar route or the Navy route or other avenues which are essentially limited for Malay Singaporeans.
Right. Okay. I think we're out of time. Terry, we're out of time?
I'm out of time.
Okay, you're out of time.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to go.
Yes.
But thank you so much for giving us almost an hour and quite a bit.
Okay.
I know you're very busy, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Paul. I'd shake your hand, but we can't do that right now.
Right.
And thank you to, which camera am I looking at now? That one. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Stay tuned. In a short time, we're scheduled to have Jose Raymond. Hopefully, he'll be able to make it today.
This broadcast will be viewable after this ends.
Yes, this broadcast will be viewable after this ends. So we're going to cut the live stream here. We'll start a new one. So thank you to all of you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. And once again, thank you to Paul. All the best to you in the upcoming election. And I hope you win.
Thank you very much.
Personally, that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, and don't forget to vote for Jose and James and Min and Alfred.
Don't worry.
Right.